Dr. Rohde, thanks for coming back to Contagion.
You bet. It's a great time to be here, and it's always a privilege to join you.
So those who did not hear our last interview, can you give us your background and then what you're working on right now? I think it'll immediately be apparent how relevant it is.
Sure. So I've got I like to call myself a hybrid professional, but currently I'm working at Texas State University. I'm the chair and a professor in the clinical laboratory science program. I'm also the associate director for a center here that we call the Translational Health Research Center. So it's really one of my passions. It's the idea of taking really anything in healthcare across all spectrums, from autism to viruses to physical health, whatever it might be, and kind of showing how that can be leveraged and translated into all sorts of projects and plans. So that's kind of my newest area that I've been working in. I'm also a researcher. Really two primary areas. I've been in virology for most of my career. So going back into the early 90s, I was at the Texas Department of Health in the Bureau of Labs and the Zoonosis Control Division, really in all things transmitted to mankind. So rabies was really, and still is really, one of my specialty areas, but as well as things like COVID and other viruses that can be transmitted to men. And then my other big focus in research is antibiotic resistant infections. So we had mentioned, earlier, we might come back sometime and talk about MRSA or some of the other antibiotic resistant issues in the world. By the way, I consider antibiotic resistance like the ongoing biggest global pandemic we've had forever. It's a real problem. But right now, I would say what I've been focused on in the last month or so, maybe even 2 or 3 months since we talked, was getting back to school. So, as you look across the landscape of the United States and really the world, people are really concerned and planning and thinking about how we can or will be able to do school, whether it's K-12 down at the lower ages or college or even post graduate type of work. At Texas State University, I've been involved in multiple work groups since probably late March, trying to plan for possible what to do this fall of 20. We've been online since late March. We continued that through the summer, except in some instances. So some things for your audience to think about. So like my program, Medical Laboratory Science, the people that conduct your medical laboratory testing in hospitals and public health labs and things like that, if you can imagine needing to be in person at some level to reach competency skills, there's, you can do certain things online like we're doing for lectures and theory and knowledge, but it's really difficult to virtually teach someone how to run a CBC, a complete blood cell count, or to do a clinical gram stain in microbiology, or if you're a nurse, if you can imagine setting a Foley catheter, and on and on and on. So we've been kind of dealing with that over the summer, trying to think about how we might do that. At Texas State, in the College of Health Professions, we're coming back primarily face-to-face next week on Monday of the 24th of August, following all above and beyond exaggerated guidelines. So we've mandated masks all over campus, outside and inside. So you cannot enter a classroom or a building without one, unless there's a medical reason. We are going to have physical distancing. We've got capacity issues in rooms figured out. For example, in my cohort of new juniors, there'll be 20 students. That's how many come into my program. So we're fortunate. We have a smaller, group of students, and we're going to be teaching for lectures in a room that holds 80 people. So we will be 10 or 12 foot apart. I mean, we will be spread out. We're still going to be masked up. We'll have hand hygiene stations, everything you've read about. We're going to be over exaggerating that. And again, I think in the College of Health Professions or other medical types of colleges, we're at an advantage because this is our world. We're always around pathogens and situations where we have to wear PPE and we have to prepare and we have to have muscle memory, and how to do these things correctly. The challenge has always been, what do you do with, a class of 400 freshman history students? That's a different challenge, Grant. And so we've looked at multiple modalities. So we're going to be doing full online for many of those classes. We're just not going to take the chance. Others that we can do it, we might have an A-B schedule. So if it's a class of 100 and we have a big auditorium, only 50 might come on a Monday. And we're still Zooming and recording that so that the other 50 can be there online. And then we flip it on Wednesday and the other 50 come, and those that were there on Monday are online now. So we kind of a hybrid type of class. So you get some interaction, again, all with safety precautions in place. And then some, like ours, again, we will have some face-to-face, but it's going to be the smaller classes and the programs that basically almost have to have in-person types of situations due to our external accrediting. We can't graduate students that don't have competencies that we measure for skill sets. So unless things get so bad where the governor or the president or someone shuts everything down, we'll be moving forward with that. So that's one thing I've been working on, is just planning, every scenario. Just try to sit down sometime and try to think about these scenarios. If you're in education, these are challenging times to think about how you might do that, because people want to know, what if 3 students in a class of 50 become positive? What do we do? Do we shut the whole class down? Do we just send those 3 home to quarantine? And so my key words to the public and really to anyone I talk about with respect to schools, and it really probably crosses over into work too, is the key word is going to be flexibility and pivot. What we have to be flexible to all the way up to closing down again and going online. We really don't know what's coming. Anyone that tells you they know, or be suspicious. As a virologist, viruses are going to virus. No matter what humans do, we are going to usually be a step behind them in some cases. And so our job is to pivot, be flexible, and have scenarios and plans in place. Even if we don't plan correctly, at least we're planning, and we're going to have somewhat of a head start on getting that in place.
Well,
go ahead.
To your point, you kind of end up with this almost a pyramid, right? You have these CDC guidelines as the foundation. Right. You have these context-based measures and faculty discretion incorporated, administrative conversation in the middle. And then that top is just that willingness to be adaptive over time and to actually change the whole structure if it needs to at different points. I think is that an accurate visual?
That is. Yeah, that's a very accurate visual. We're going to start, I think most, at least universities, are going to start with that CDC public health guidance. There are lots of protocols and assistance, so people should seek those out if they need them. But the ability to use your expertise at the university and external to the university. For instance, I'm a virologist and somewhat of an infectious disease specialist, also specialized in testing and things like that. So I can also assist with our primary medical officer and the student health center to kind of discuss testing and maybe contact tracing on campus. I can talk with faculty and staff who may have real concerns because of their comorbidities. And so just being understanding and adaptable is really the only way forward in the coming months, because we're going to have to be ready to do that. We have potentially, I've been seeing this hashtag recently. It's kind of an interesting hashtag of, we want to be careful of a twin-demic, right? So flu's coming. Flu comes every year around late September, October for the United States, and it kind of runs through March, April. So we've got to also be on board with public health precautions around getting your vaccine for flu and being prepared for that. And so that we we kind of watched that modality because you could have an increase in cases for respiratory illness, even if it's not COVID. And so you could overwhelm hospitals because now you're dumping flu on top of COVID and things like that. So those are those scenarios, that public health and healthcare are trying to plan for and think about, even within a university. So if you can imagine the scenario of a dormitory and you have thousands of students and you've tried to parse them out, keeping them with the same roommate, kind of creating a bubble for the semester and seeing how that might play out. But we have plans, and you have to plan for what happens if people get positive. And so we have contingency plans where we're keeping rooms empty. I forget the number, but dozens and dozens and dozens of rooms that we're not going to use, so that if something happens, we can transition a student over by themselves into kind of a quarantine status. They can go online if they weren't already online, and they can continue their education if they don't need medical assistance, of course. And so contingencies all over the place. So again, I would tell your audience and others out there that are dealing with this as parents and government officials, and everybody has a vested interest in this, is that people are working really hard. Just a sneak peek behind the door here. I mean, we're working really hard to try to get this right. We can't promise zero risk. I mean, it's a respiratory virus. We just can't. But we can mitigate it. We can plan, and we can do the best we can. And we are working our tails off. We've been doing it for months now to try to plan correctly. And yet we're going to be ready to pivot to whatever we have to do to make it safe if that comes into place. The challenges for me, even more so, my wife's a pre-K teacher. So she teaches 4-year-olds. That's a really challenging scenario. And I really have sympathy for the K-12 school district, especially that 4-year-old up to about 8 or 9 or 10, where, it's going to be a challenge. I mean, my wife always talks about, as a pre-K teacher, 4-year-olds are crawling all over her. They want to love on her. They want your attention. You're really close to them a lot of times. So, that's a different scenario. And so I think, again, depending on your situation, there is no perfect one size fits all in education. So I would just encourage people that are out there in education to educate yourself, to ask questions, to plan, to be ready to change and pivot, and to prepare your staff and faculty that's what we're going to do. We're just going to have to pivot if we need to.
It's a really interesting way of putting it with the younger children as well. How do you encourage something like physical distancing in that
right
sense?
It's almost impossible. It's almost impossible when you think about, I mean, I'll just use my wife as an example. She has typically 16 to 24-year-olds in a classroom about the size of a kind of a typical classroom. And she has one assistant, and, they're doing story time where they sit down on mats and they're all gathering around her, and she's reading to them, or they're learning their letters. They're singing. They're doing things that you just don't think about, as a college professor. So when she asks me, or her colleagues ask me, sometimes I think about, are face shields with a mask for the faculty and the staff important, because maybe there's more respiratory transmission because of that singing and screaming. I mean, you know what it was like to be a 4-year-old, and they're excited and they're laughing and they're on top of each other. And it's just so challenging, Grant. I mean, my wife is almost frustrated to the point of, if it's not going to be fun,
Yeah.
I mean, to tell a 4-year-old that you can't move and to climb, I mean, they learn through play.
Yeah.
It's so challenging. It's really a challenging time.
And it makes you wonder, what are the options? And it's one of those things where the choices and the ethics of it are very muddled, because you can't really ask every working parent for their next year until what time in 2021 are we going
Right.
to get a vaccine, to not have their kid go to school. And then you also can't ask a teacher to have that exactly that face close contact, that heightened risk, especially teachers with comorbidity potential need to have specific adaptive policies made for them, and you can keep kids with lower risk, with higher risk, I'm sorry, outside of the school altogether potentially. To your
Mhm.
point too about the singing, it's not as simple as put it outside either, because you have different levels of risk for transmission even among children, where that camp in Georgia, for example, you had a bunch of unmasked children yelling, singing. There wasn't really even an attempt to say, well, how could we do camp in a COVID way? It was more just the usual business as usual kind of thing. And that's something that maybe gets lost too in the reopening conversation.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, whether it's a camp or a class, indoor or outdoor, there is no zero risk unless, you are 50 foot away and I mean, you're screaming at each other. I mean, so that's just not going to work that way. So yeah, absolutely. It's a difficult thing to think about. Again, what I hope we do as a country and really around the world, but certainly in the US, I hope that we are understanding, open-minded, and listening to the science and best evidence. I mean, I don't know how else to put it to people. The people that are, really critical and that they need to kind of sit back for a moment and remember that this is unprecedented in my history, and really there's probably, I mean, unless you're 100 years old, you haven't been through this before. So we really need to be open-minded. We need to be learning lessons as we go, and thinking about how we can do this, or do we not do it? Like, this is just not going to work for 4-year-olds, and that is a hard, tough decision because it's such a critical learning time. To lose even a half a year is what people are worried about that are in education. But at what risk? So there's that risk reward type thing, a risk benefit type of decision, and I do not envy any principal, any superintendent, any teacher right now. And so my ongoing theme has been to be understanding, supportive, ask questions. You can be critical of people, but offer suggestions. I mean, don't go on a tirade against people that are probably working very hard to do the right thing. The only thing that is frustrating, I will say, as a public health person, is when people just totally ignore public health precautions. And I don't care what your pick: distancing, mask, hand hygiene, whatever you want to pick. I just hope the country can get behind basic public health, infection control, and prevention measures, because we know they work. I mean, history shows us they work. And so, hopefully some of that will calm down as we move forward.
Definitely needs to be less of a political issue, I would argue.
Yes, absolutely. What else are we dealing with? So, we kind of think about
Well, we
some of the
could we could zoom out if you want about the different testing modalities.
sure, sure. So I think, and that's kind of where I was going. I think one of the ongoing struggles in this country, and maybe other places as well, but I feel it as a medical laboratory and public health professional. The question about testing is just continuing, and so it's frustrating to kind of think about that in the United States of America, you're still hearing issues around turnaround times. We're seeing in some states and places people talking about, 7, 10, 12 days. I've heard other kind of crazy outliers, where they're waiting 3 weeks or something like that. So there's problems with that, obviously. One of the problems is that contact tracing. So for your audience, contact tracing is when you identify a positive person, you want to interview them as soon as possible to find out who they've come into contact with, where they've been, so that you can kind of triage around that group of maybe a dozen or 15 people to, self-monitor. Maybe you need to stay home for a couple of days, or I'm sorry, a couple of weeks, And so we control that spread, that community spread. If you're talking about 7 days, I mean, anything past about 3 days, 48 to 72 hours, it almost becomes a spinning your wheels to contact trace. I mean, if someone's been out doing things for 10 days and you just find out you're positive, that's almost, it's not a total waste of time, but it's a problem. You've really extended your work efforts to try to contact trace. So we've really got to get that fixed. And I think it starts with, again, this is my professional opinion, but I think a lot of my colleagues would agree. We need a national testing strategy that makes sense. We need to get pieces in place so that states and counties and local communities are on the same page. And that's across public health, government, and other entities so that people kind of know what's going to happen, and tie that to electronic health records so that we can get information disseminated quickly so that we can contact trace appropriately. So that's one piece of testing that's frustrating. The other piece, I think, is I was just looking at a story today, in fact. So today's August 17th, 2020. And I was reading a story, kind of a Twitter feed from a scientist who was explaining a brand new direct saliva test. And this was a great explanation because it was being promoted as a very rapid kind of answer to things. But when you looked at the specifics of the test, it's still about a 3-hour test. There's still some major issues around, see if I can explain this. It's one thing to have a test that works, but to ramp it up for high throughput sometimes might require robots or other rapid pipetting devices, so the ability to maneuver specimens into different platforms. And again, the general public doesn't always see that or understand it, but it's more than just the test. And so we need to be thinking innovatively about automation. Is the test working well enough that we want it to be utilized? So is there a high sensitivity and specificity? Accuracy, is it telling us if it's positive, it's truly positive? If it's negative, it's truly negative. Those are critical pieces, and that ties back into so many factors, like, do you have the right professionals running the test and validating the test, and making sure that all of that analytical specificity and sensitivity is correct? And again, to kind of bring that down into more common language for your audience, perhaps, I mean, sensitivity basically means you can think about it as kind of a big wide net. So a test that is 80% sensitive means that 8 out of every 10 8 out of every 10 kind of positive samples will be collected and kind of utilized in that way. Specificity means that it's always right, basically. So if you're getting down into sensitivities and specificities that are like flipping a coin, you're kind of, that becomes, I don't know if that's very a useful test in general. I mean, if it's the only thing you have, it might be helpful, but we need to be looking for those tests that are going to give us the best answer most of the time, so that contact tracing's being done correctly, and so on and so forth. So there's a rippling effect across that testing platform. So you can have the greatest test in the world, but it still comes down to using it correctly and having the right professionals run and set those tests up. Just so critical. I can't emphasize it enough.
Dr. Rohde, thank you for all of these great insights and for your time.
Really. Absolutely. I'm always happy to come on, Grant, and I love what Contagion's doing with respect to health literacy and science communication. I think the world needs your type of platform right now. So I just applaud everything you're doing, and others like you that are trying to reach into that world that you need to reach into, and then bring it out in a way that hopefully people can understand it. And even if they can't, they know that I better go find somebody that can help me to understand it in a way that can be meaningful to them. So I just appreciate what you're doing.
Absolutely. It's really all about platforming that scientific conversation. What me or anybody else on editorial thinks about the coronavirus, it's ultimately that's where we're going with it. Is let's make sure that we're getting the scientific debate out there in a way that's polite, informative, easy to understand.
Right on, right on. Thanks so much. I look forward to joining you again, probably in the next month or two. We'll be looking at those dates around the 1st of October when you start thinking about school and sports, and we'll see what's happening in mid-fall or how flu's looking and things like that. So it's going to be an interesting month or two.
Not going away. All right.
Yes,
Talk to
sir.
you soon.
Got like a dozen of them, just really interesting, for when people come by and visit, or they're pretty good, tools to like teach too. If you're,
Oh, I know. This coronavirus one is packed with information in this little, like
yeah,
like the
yeah,
Beanie Baby
yeah, those are great.
bio. It's
It's a
so
good visual to kind of explain, the spikes and the different things coming off the surface there. So yeah, it's
exactly, yeah. That's the spike protein,
yep.
exactly. You know.